Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I can see loads of you in the attendee panel, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for turning up today. My name's Angela Gage. I work for Bristol University Press. I just wanted to thank you for coming along to this book launch for Against Youth Violence, a Social Harm Perspective by Luke Billingham and Keir Irwin-Rogers. This webinar will be recorded, although as a viewer, you won't be visible. And we'll send everyone a link to the recording shortly afterwards. Bristol University Press are delighted to be publishing this book, which provides a piercing insight into the pressing and much debated issue of the nature of youth violence in the UK. As Luke and Keir say in their introduction to the book, for far too many children and young people, Britain is a harmful society in which to grow up. This book shines a light on the key issues in the hope that harms can be reduced. We're also joined by Dez Holmes, Director of Research and Practice, a not-for-profit organisation that supports the children's and adult sector to use evidence within practice and leadership. Dez will be facilitating the discussion. Thank you so much, Dez. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and use the chat for any technical issues. Hopefully nothing will turn up. The panellists will try to answer as many of your questions as they can at the end of the webinar. I'll now hand over to Dez. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. It's a real pleasure to be here and you're delighted to be able to facilitate this discussion. All I'm going to do at this point is introduce our co-authors of this excellent book. I'm not on commission, but I'm clutching my beloved copy here. I hope that many of you are as well. So I'll just introduce the authors. Luke Billingham, for those of you who don't know him, is a youth and community worker at Hackney Quest and also a research associate at the Open University. And Keir Irwin-Rogers is a senior lecturer in criminology at the Open University. And I think you've done a terrific job, so I declare my bias from the outset. And you're going to be able to give colleagues an overview of the book and talk us through some of the key themes. So I'll hand over to you at this point, where there will be no tech fail.
Hi everybody, just bear with me 1 second while I get the presentation going. Just let me know if you can see this on screen. Is this in presenter mode or am I good there? We're all good, I think. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate it, taking time out of your day. I also want to say thank you to people who've sent some really nice messages through over the past couple of weeks since the book's gone live. And kind of in an age of social media and smartphones, it lets people send these lovely messages. It's been really nice to see them. There's a few on screen there. There's also a couple of jokers in the pack that decided to send some banterous messages. One of my favorite was this one here from a friend called Matt. So he sent that image along with it. It was something like, "Hi Keir, read a couple of pages, it's rubbish, but it does make a very nice coaster for my coffee," which I thought was pretty brutal. But then I looked a bit more closely at the actual image, and that's a hardback copy right there. They're 80 quid. So that is one of the most expensive coasters that friend will have ever bought. So if anything, the joke's on him. And then the other one I quite appreciated was this one, where you can see quite clearly it's a position of the book is right next to a toilet. That was sharper text added to that one. It was just perfect. So I think we can see what that person is trying to say about the quality of our work. So whether or not you sent a nice message or a banterous one, we appreciate all those messages coming in. It means a lot. It's nice to see people finally having a copy of the book after all the work that's gone into it. So Against Youth Violence, this is our book, and this is an overview of it. Introduction and conclusion and 6 chapters. Before we get going on the book itself, I just briefly want to introduce Luke, who he is. Here he is, a lovely, wonderful man, looking very casual there, giving a talk. Luke often is casual, regardless of the event. He'll turn up in trackies and trainers and t-shirt. I haven't actually clocked what he's wearing today, but he's got a hoodie on. See, I told you, even casual for his own book launch. He's a wonderful person. He works for Hackney Quest as a youth worker. He also does work for someone called Newbridge, which is mentoring with people in prison. I'm Keir Irwin-Rogers, as Des said, a lecturer with the Open University, and we met when we were working for the Cross-Party Youth Violence Commission, which is a long time ago now. This kind of takes us back to pre-COVID years, which feels like an era ago. This commission was cross-party, and it was designed and set up by MPs who basically thought that not enough was being done to address high levels of violence in their constituencies, and they wanted a commission established to look into the root causes of violence and evidence-based solutions to address it. And Luke and I worked together on that commission and co-authored its final report together back in 2020. That came out. That basically led to another project that we've been working on the past couple of years. We're 2 years into a 3-year project. It's due to end December 2023, so we've got a big year next year with all the findings and the impact events. It's called Public Health, Youth and Violence Reduction. Collaboration of 4 universities, and we're looking at public health approaches to violence reduction on that one. And basically all of this work that I've just been talking about, and some of the research and studies that I've done, aside from the work with the Commission and the Public Health, Youth and Violence Reduction Project, led us to believe that we had something worth putting down on paper to produce this book. And so we have. And let me start talking about it now. So the title is Against Youth Violence. One of the things that people have said to me is it's a rubbish title. Like, who would be for youth violence? So why have you chose that title? Fair point. We're against youth violence in 3 senses of the term, and they're outlined in the introduction. I'm not going to go into detail about them now because we need to keep this relatively succinct, but hopefully at the end of the presentation, you'll have an idea about the 3 different ways that we're against youth violence. And then chapter 1, riveting chapter, all about data and stats, and the graphs about violence in Britain. It's one of the chapters I led on, and I love the data, I love the stats, and I said to Luke, we should spend most of our time getting these graphs up and going through them in minute detail. And Luke said, people will be bored by that. Don't do that. And usually when we have a disagreement, Luke is the one that wins out. So there's no graphs or data in this. So some of you might be disappointed. Most of you probably not, because Luke is typically right. But if you want to talk about what the data says and what the stats say that's kind of covered in chapter 1, we can do that in the Q&A potentially. So I'm going to dive into what we say about social harm. It's part of a social harm series. So we see this concept of social harm being really important. You can probably see the white books behind me. There's a whole series of books on social harm that are fantastic, and kind of we've been drawing on other people's work on social harm for this book. But we took a bit of a different direction than other people on social harm. We kind of came up with our own definition. We see this as a really, really useful concept for making sense of children and young people's lives, and hopefully I can get a sense of why that is. It might be a new term or a new concept to a lot of people on the call, so I'll briefly talk about our approach to it. The definition's in the box. So the term social harm refers to something that compromises human flourishing in a manner that could have been prevented. We think that's a relatively straightforward definition, but in kind of closing that box on what social harm is, we open a box on what human flourishing is, because if social harm is something that compromises human flourishing, then it's important to know what human flourishing is. And so we also have to define and kind of describe our approach to human flourishing. It's on the screen. I think it's going to be relatively small for you. I hope you can read it. If you can't, I'll talk us through it anyway. But essentially, we think that human flourishing can be broken down into 2 different components. I actually think there's a third component, and it's one of the things that Luke and I actually disagreed with. We agree on most things, and this book was relatively amicable. But I think if you go to chapter 2, it's the not that this is emblazoned in my mind, but if you go to the footnote 4 on chapter 2, you'll see a big description of the disagreement Luke and I had about a third component of human flourishing that I think is important. But let's park that for now. There are 2 components that we've gone with in this book. One's need fulfillment. So everyone in the call, you can kind of think about the things that you need in your life in order for there to be a good platform for your life to be considered to be flourishing. So affection, creativity, freedom, identity, leisure, participation, reproduction, security, spirituality, subsistence, and understanding. We think all of those are really important needs, which, if fulfilled, will provide a good platform for someone to have a flourishing life. So subsistence, for example, do we have a roof over our heads that keeps us, safe from the elements? Can we have food on the table? Do we have access to clean water, and so on and so forth? Understanding, do we have a good access to an education system that helps us know about the world around us? And all those needs we think are really important. And you can kind of think of human flourishing in those terms. But there's another way I think that human flourishing can also be thought of, and that's in terms of subjective well-being. So regardless of those things that people have in their lives, what people need to have in their lives, what do they actually think about their lives themselves? So what do we think about our life or particular aspects of it? How do we feel? What's our emotional state? And what's our sense of meaning or purpose? And generally speaking, those 2 things will move together. So as needs are fulfilled, so subjective well-being will probably be higher, but they're not linked in a determinative sense. It's not as if All people with high levels of need fulfillment will be very happy, and all people with low levels of need fulfillment will be emotionally distraught and sad. There are really complicated relationships between those two things, and I think is really interesting to explore. And we use this concept of human flourishing to make sense of children and young people's lives in Britain, contemporary day, and in fact over the past couple of decades. So chapter 2 is very much a theoretical conceptual chapter that goes into some of the things I've just been discussing. And then in chapter 4, we move on to say, well, what does this actually mean for children and young people today in Britain? And if you look at that chart on the right-hand side of the screen, I think it might be a little small for people, but I'll talk us through it. We find there are numerous and varied social harms in children and young people's lives. Top of the list in terms of scale, and it's probably going to surprise no one, but child poverty is just absolutely horrendous levels in the UK. I think it's there as 30% of children under the age of 16 live in child poverty in the UK. So that equates to millions of children. I think whether you're on the political left or the political right, everyone seems to agree that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. I think there's a debate to be had about how we address that problem, and that's where politics comes into it. But I think everyone can agree that our levels of child poverty are shocking and that they need to be addressed. And these are the sorts of things that chapter 4 discusses in detail. Why is our rates of poverty so bad, and why do they need attention? We also talk about other social harms like children not being in education and employment and training. NEET, 11.3% of children there. So again, I think that's into the millions. And we talk about school exclusions. This is a hot potato. I've had some kickback in recent weeks talking about this one. We feel that exclusion levels are too high. Lots of children getting fixed term exclusions in particular, and this is a problem. But I think lots of people in education are a bit sensitive to that, because they kind of see it as they have no option but to exclude in certain instances in order to protect other children from, and protect other children's learning. Children need to be excluded. And I think it's important to highlight, like what Luke and I are saying in this particular case is not that schools and teachers should just have a blanket policy that we don't exclude, but that we need to build educational environments, and we need to resource schools in a way and provide training in a way that means we have environments conducive to lower levels of exclusion. So we don't find ourselves in the position where we need to exclude children at these sort of rates. But you can see why it's a social harm, because it's clearly something that compromises human flourishing. So in terms of need fulfillment, it would compromise a young person's understanding. It would affect their subjective well-being. We know exclusions obviously highly demotivate young people, affects their thoughts about different aspects of their lives and their sense of purpose. So clearly it's a social harm because it's compromising human flourishing in a manner that could have been prevented. And then the fourth social harm on the screen there is children living in temporary accommodation. So as you go down this list, the scale is getting lower. So there's only 1.1% of children living in temporary accommodation in England. But yeah, I think I'm trying to remember the precise number from the book. I think it's still something like 117,000 children that equates to who are living in temporary accommodation. And in a country as rich and affluent as the UK, again, that's shocking. And then we kind of juxtapose that against levels of violence in young people's lives. So the bottom two on that graph are young people proceeded against for violence with injury. And that's a much, much lower percentage of young people. So 0.2% of young people in London were proceeded against for violence and injury. So it's a fraction of the number of young people, for example, that are affected by poverty. And the higher the level of violence, the more serious the violence, the lower the percentage of young people involved, all the way down to, for example, homicide prosecutions, where I think tonight is the precise figures 0.00087 young people, percent of young people are prosecuted for homicide. So it's not that we're saying that violence isn't an important issue, because clearly it is. And when it does occur, and when it's serious violence, it has devastating effects for the children involved and for their families and for the communities. But that we do think that it needs to be set in the context of other forms of harm in children and young people's lives that are far more prevalent. And one of the reasons we think that's important is because if you address these social harms in and of themselves, that will make life for children and young people far better in our society. But in addition, our argument in the book is that if we address these social harms, that will in turn have an impact on rates of violence in society. And it's at that point, I think I can hand over to Luke, who's going to give some thoughts on how social harm relates to violence and what generates violence in Britain. So I'm going to hand over to you, Luke. I'll do the slides. Just give me a thumbs up if I need to move on. I haven't.
Cool. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yeah?
You can. Absolutely.
Excellent. Afternoon all. Thanks very much for coming. So with my section of the talk, we're going to have a bit of a shift in focus, a slight shift in font, you might have noticed, and a definite shift in accent, We're going from the west of the Midlands to the northeast of London. Keir's covered bits of chapter 1, 2, and 4. I'm going to do my best to cover kind of key points from chapters 3, 5, and 6, but not in that order. Keir's laid out, I think, what are the main points from the book in relation to social harm and young people. What I'm going to kind of attempt to summarize is our main points in relation to young people and violence. And I think ultimately, the driving point of our book is that we need a carefully balanced response to the problem of violence among young people. On the one hand, as Keir has said, it's a tiny minority of young people in this country involved in violence. And as we demonstrate in chapter 1, levels of violence in this country now are lower than they have been within the past few decades. Despite what some headlines can suggest, we don't have the highest rates of violence that we've ever seen. And it is certainly not only young people who commit acts of violence. So we need to avoid sensationalism. We need to avoid the lazy cliches about this generation of young people exhibiting unprecedented barbarism. And we definitely need to avoid the temptation to position ourselves as adults as somehow morally superior, casting a judgmental gaze down on young people below us, treating violence as if it's some self-generated property of youth. And those are things that we talk a lot about in the book. On the other hand, we need to balance all of that with the fact that there is still far too much injury and death among our young people caused by their peers. I know that all too well, growing up in a community which is affected by high rates of violence and working there now as a youth worker for near on a decade. And we do consistently have among the highest rates of violence in Western Europe in this country. So what do we do? How should we approach this issue? I think rather than looking down on young people as a demonized generational mass, what we need to do is look upwards at the policies and the systems that we as adults have created. And we need to look backwards at the history of our society. What we need to consider is what Elliot Curry has called the social conditions that predictably breed violence. Our starting point should be, at this moment in history, in this country, what is the predicament facing young people growing up? And how does that predicament, in too many cases, engender violence? This is a much more difficult, but a much more fruitful endeavor than seeking out what Joe Cottrell Boyce has called bounded receptacles for blame. Those all too convenient 1 or 2 word answers that are all too popular. It's all gangs. It's all troubled families. It's because of the drill music. It's because of the social media. What we need to do and we need to take responsibility for as adults is doing a better job of reducing the social harms that Keir mentioned, and ultimately a better job of creating conducive conditions for safety, for well-being, for care, for love, for flourishing, and for peace among young people. And to do that, we first need to understand the conditions that currently breed violence. From all of our research for the book, from my direct experience with young people, from previous work with the Youth Violence Commission, we think that fundamentally, the problem of violence in this country relates to 4 very tightly connected inequalities. Click. Cheers. These inequalities relate closely to and often drive the social harms that Keir mentioned a moment ago. And they encourage the kinds of social norms and the kinds of psychological tension which make violence more likely. I'm going to talk about the 4 in 2 color-coded pairs. So first of all, resources and recognition. By resources, I'm referring essentially to wealth and income. And inequality of wealth and income in Britain is truly ludicrous. We've got eye-watering wealth in this country, and we've got destitution. London is among the very wealthiest cities in the world. And in Hackney, where I'm from and where I work, 46% of children are growing up in poverty. And in other boroughs of London, it's even higher. The Financial Times, that bastion of radical leftism, recently concluded from their analysis that income inequality in the US and the UK is so wide that while the richest are very well off, the poorest have a worse standard of living than the poorest in countries like Slovenia. Essentially, the FT says, the US and the UK are poor societies with some very rich people in them. Too many people live in our country without sufficient resources for a basic sense of life security or dignity. And this is particularly because inequality of resources is so closely connected with disparities in recognition. So when we talk about recognition, we're using it in the way it's used by political philosophers. It refers to a kind of foundational respect, the basic acknowledgement and appreciation that you need in order to feel that you're of value. Philosophers agree on the deeply harmful effects of misrecognition, disrespect, degradation. This can take many forms, but one of the most pernicious and damaging forms of misrecognition is racist prejudice. Now, resources and recognition may be separable in theory, but in reality, they're very closely entwined. Mike Savage, the sociologist, recently wrote in his book that it's not analytically helpful to separate the two because they are so entwined. If you have huge inequalities in resources, particularly in a self-styled meritocracy like Britain, this will always be tightly bound to inequalities in status and stigma, respect and recognition. And we see these interwoven inequalities of political and moral economy most vividly in ethnographies and studies of marginalized communities, not just in this country. If you read Elijah Anderson on Philadelphia, if you read Rob White on marginalized communities in Australia, John Pitts on Waltham Forest, Tony Ellis on post-industrial northern communities in Britain. If you read Reclaim Manchester, the group of young people who've produced research on their area. If you read Take Back the Power, written group of young people written very powerfully about the nature of their community in Camden. All of these places, of course, have significant idiosyncrasies and nuances. But what all of these different studies, all these different writers show is how material scarcity is always paired with this sense of denigration and diminishment when they coexist in a vastly unequal society. And as Randy Contreras has put it, based on his study in the Bronx in New York, as long as huge social inequality exists, the marginal will find creative and sometimes deadly ways to earn respect, to be somebody. What massive inequalities of resources and recognition do is foster a kind of structural humiliation. Shame and rage reverberate around neighborhoods, and we know these are emotions that can heighten the likelihood of violence. And the fear is that these inequalities may be getting worse. Power and privilege are ever more concentrated at the top of our society, while among those most marginalized, we see increasing pressure, pain, and powerlessness. So if resources and recognition seem to be magnetized upwards, these next two R's, risk and state retribution, seem to be concentrated downwards. And this is because of how they're connected. Firstly, risk. In those communities which experience the harshest scarcity of resources and recognition, we also tend to see heightened risks of many kinds, which are often connected with one another, of physical and mental health issues, of unemployment, of homelessness, for instance. And you can think of this connection in the institutional as well as individual senses. If you think about schools, like Keir mentioned, if they've got inadequate resources and inadequate respect to recognition for their role as safeguarding institutions, they're less able to keep students safe from the risk of harm, including violence. And there are also significant inequalities in state retribution, everything from school exclusion to over-policing to imprisonment. All forms of punitiveness tend to be disproportionately experienced by those with the least resources and the least recognition, working class people of color, for instance. This is a problem in itself, but it also deepens alienation from the state, deepens marginalization, and can thus weaken protection from violence. So what we have in this country is a mesh of connected inequalities. We have people and places which experience substantial prosperity, prestige, protection, and pity from the state. Then we have pockets of our society which we very effectively provide with the known social and emotional precipitants of violence. They experience the conjoined pressures of poverty and belittlement, whilst being exposed to disproportionality in both the danger and the punitiveness that they encounter. These are the social conditions that predictably breed violence. But there's one more R word, that I want to mention that's closely tied with these inequalities: relationships. I think those four inequalities that I've discussed briefly have all kinds of significant effects on the quality of relationships across our society. And there's a ton of different things that I could say about this, but I'm just briefly going to mention a few. Firstly, taking parenting relationships, arguably the most important relationships that there are. Parenting is an enormously complex craft, as me and Keir know, as parents of small children. But we know that parenting is made infinitely more difficult by scarcity of resources and recognition. financial hardship and stigma make the immense caring work of parenting a lot more complex and difficult. By allowing destitution and degradation among parents in this country, we're not creating conducive conditions for their children to be nurtured or to flourish. And again, an analogous point applies to the public sector workers in important institutions, teachers, nursery workers, the police, healthcare professionals. If their services and institutions are under-resourced and under-respected, and they personally are underpaid and under-recognized, they're not in a good position to build relationships with those that they support. And we know how fundamental those relationships are. So by simultaneously heightening poverty and pressure on both families, individuals, and services, we're removing the preconditions for effective personal and professional relationships. We're taking away the prerequisites for care. And you see the same in relationships between peers, which can be hugely harmed by gross inequalities in resources and recognition. These inequalities breed envy, suspicion, avarice, competitiveness. It's been argued by a group called the Care Collective that we live in a systemically careless society. And I think that has a lot to do with the extent and the impact of these four inequalities. So we need to address these inequalities if we're to see less social harm in young people's lives, and if we're to create conducive conditions for well-being, for safety, for flourishing, for peace and care, for, among, and between our young people. So that is the kind of high level macro orientation that we think is needed. These inequalities need to be addressed. The other thing I briefly want to summarize for this talk is the more subjective, the more psychological side of this. What does it feel like to live in a society affected by these inequalities? There are lots of different ways to consider young people's psychologies and their internal lives. A concept that I've found helpful when reflecting on the lives of the young people I live with and reflecting on the research that I've seen is mattering. Glottal stop isn't helpful always. The youth worker Lee Deemer, who set up a project called St Matthew's in Brixton, I think puts this the best. He captures the idea of mattering and its connection to violence very aptly when he says this: there are young men literally dying to be someone or something, anything but no one and nothing. And this perfectly summarizes the idea of mattering as it's been developed by academic psychologists like Gordon Fleck, Gregory Elliott, and Isaac Prelel-Tensky. They all suggest that in order to feel that we matter, in order to sense that we matter, we need these two things. Firstly, to feel that we're significant to others, we're valued, noticed, respected by others with whom we have a meaningful connection. And secondly, a kind of agentic power. We need to feel that our existence makes a difference in the wider world, that we've got some degree of causal power, agency, potency. Returning to Lee Deemer's words, we need to feel that we're someone, a person of worth to others, and we need to feel that we are something, a person who has a material influence on the world around us. And we see this in babies, the glee when they first discover that they can move objects or make their parents react to them, and their horror when either of those things are denied them. Researchers have called this glee the pleasure of being the cause, and this horror the trauma of failed influence. We see it in ourselves as well. We all want to achieve a degree of both recognition and impact within the social circles, the fields, the industries that we emotionally invest ourselves in. There's plenty of quantitative research which highlights the importance of mattering specifically to young people too. It's been shown that feeling they matter can significantly increase their well-being, while a lack of mattering has been connected with a greater propensity to suicidal ideation, self-harm, and violence. It seems that the association between a lack of mattering and self-harm is stronger in young females, while the association between lack of mattering and violence, harming others, is stronger in young men. From my youth work, working directly with young people, and from our research for this book, my concern is that in 21st century Britain, particularly because of those four entwined inequalities I discussed a moment ago, and the social harms that Keir laid out earlier, and the sense of structural humiliation that all of that can cumulatively create, too many young people are living their lives fearing that they are no one and nothing. At worst, young people are staring into what violence scholar Anthony Ellis has called the terrifying abyss of insignificance. In young men in particular, I think this can exacerbate the desperation to feel substantial, to feel big, to feel significant. and in some, the compulsion to violently assert yourself. The desire to be the big man is a reflection of the terror of being nothing, and it can be a literal desire to assert yourself over space and through time. Territorial reputation building or dominance is about expanding yourself through a place and down generations. Ego and narcissism are involved in this, I'm sure, but it's intensified in those communities in which too many young men are made to feel utterly inconsequential within mainstream society or legit institutions, who feel the pain and the pressure of societal disrespect and material scarcity. And lastly, I think that this lack of mattering can also encourage a kind of nihilism or nihilistic violence. If you struggle to see significance in yourself, you can struggle to see the significance, the meaning of the world. Feeling a lack of mattering can be tied to experiencing a lack of meaning. In his recent book, Cut Short, youth worker Kieran Thapper quotes his friend, Suki, who lost his brother to violence. Suki says that he thinks too many young people have no reference point for what a good life can be. They have no value for themselves and in turn, no value for others. Society has told them that they're of little value. If we continue to allow gargantuan inequalities in resources, recognition, risk, and state retribution, we are effectively saying to great swathes of our population that they're of little value. This is both inherently wrong and an exacerbator of violence. And I'm going to hand back to Keir to talk quite specifically about what we think needs to change.
Thanks, Luke. That was fantastic. Yeah, what needs to change? So I'm actually going to try and wrap this up and talk about how to move towards a violence-free society. So Luke's been talking about what generates violence in society. I'm going to try and do a kind of, within minutes, try and wrap this up because I know time is ticking. I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So moving towards a violence-free society, I think, is going to require moving away from, and this is something Luke mentioned in his piece, away from approaches that centre on proximate and bounded receptacles for blame. So those things that Luke was talking about, gangs, social media, drill music, troubled families, these things that kind of pop up as kind of isolated things that we can define and target, lop off all of that important stuff that Luke was talking about and distort the nature of the problem and capture a disproportionate amount of resources in trying to solve them. And it takes us in a direction that is very, very unhelpful. So we need to move away from that sort of approach. We need to move away from the myth that Britain is an inherently peaceful and stable society, and that violence is therefore an aberration caused by others. And Luke writes about this beautifully. I think it's in chapter 6, where looks across history, where there's this kind of narrative that has been built up that England and Britain is a civilized society, and therefore if there are any problems with the society, it can't be to do with the British or the English or the way the society is structured. It's just this group of others that are causing these problems. And kind of in recent years, this is most obviously the case to do with immigration and people of colour. And in London, in black youth culture, or in northern cities, we see articles in the media about Asian gangs. So it's not to do with society and the way it's structured and all those things Luke was talking about, but it's just these other groups that are causing the problems. And obviously we need to move away from those myths if we're going to move towards a violence-free society as well. And then C, moving away from approaches that treat youth violence as a social problem that can be solved via discrete programs, tactics and interventions. This is a very live issue at the moment and a real political hot potato. It's something that's on the table right now and being battled over. But I think Elliot Curry provides a really good quote on this. And he's one of the people that endorsed the book. We've got a lovely quote from Elliot Curry on the back of our book. But he wrote, "Part of our problem has been the tendency to grasp at some new youth program or police tactic as if it will somehow overcome the effects of generations of exploitation and dispossession and the absence of solid paths to a more secure future." I'm probably going to come back to this in a second, but just bear with me for 1 second. So what we think we need is a fundamental shift in our approach. And we need to focus on a more fundamental reorientation of policy centered on a more equitable distribution of those 4 R's that Luke's been talking about. So recognition, resources, risk, and state retribution. And every time we think about creating policy around children and young people, we think that's a good question to ask. Will this reduce or exacerbate inequalities in the 4 R's? And there's some policy areas. And I guess I don't want to get too much into this, and our book doesn't do that either, but as part of our work with the Youth Violence Commission, I think we came up with a raft of maybe 60 or 70 specific policies across these policy areas that could make a difference, in our opinion. And we were working with people who were experts in these areas and who knew these areas very, very well. And I think if you're going to talk about specific policies, that's really important. And it's kind of at this stage that I become more tentative. And I think kind of Luke and my expertise we have to acknowledge that probably we're getting to the point where we don't want to be recommending specific policies, but we do think that we've provided a lens through which the creation of policy can be considered. And as I say, that's the lens of those inequalities in the 4 Rs. And I guess to try and make it clear why we think that's important, if you go back to C there, the approaches that treat youth violence as a social problem that can be solved via discrete programs, just think about some of the countries and cities in the world that are relatively violence-free, that have low levels of violence. So I don't know, I've looked this up a long time ago, but I think cities like Helsinki, Copenhagen, Osaka, Shenzhen, like there are cities all over the world with low rates of violence. What is it about those places that means that they're conducive to low rates of violence? It isn't because they've got a ton of discrete programs, tactics, and interventions that make them safe. There are not loads of violence reduction programs in those cities. It's because they do a very good job of making sure that their policies mean there's a relatively equal distribution of the 4 Rs. And so this is why we kind of push towards this and further away from some of these things that are on this screen here. Because time is limited, like I could talk about the sort of policies that we would see in some of these areas, and I'm more than happy to in Q&A if that's what people are interested in. But I guess a lot of it is actually in the Youth Violence Commission's report that we published in 2020. And I guess the way that I'd like to sum this up is actually by reading something that Luke wrote. So this is from the book, but these are Luke's words, so I don't feel too egotistical kind of reading it word from word. The best bits in the book are all written by Luke because he's incredibly intelligent and eloquent. Let me read it. There's a lot here, so there's not a lot of words, but I think there's a huge amount in this passage. And he writes, we call it the fire analogy: the accumulation over time of concentrated structural harms in particular places is like kindle, oxygen, and heat, which sets these places alight. The communities most harmed by the policies, systems, and institutions of this country are on fire. Some young people and families in these areas are better insulated from the flames, and the blaze will manifest differently between people, sparking creative brilliance in some, but violent emotions in others. There's definite value in trying to work out how some young people stay safer from the fire than others, and there's clear worth in examining why the flames have differing effects on people. And it's certainly fruitful to both train more firefighters, those who support the young people experiencing most social harm, and to provide them with better equipment. So just to be clear, because I think it's really, really important to be clear on this point, we're not saying that the kind of violence reduction initiatives, those things that work at like a tertiary level, all these programs to try and reduce violence are not important. In the same way that if I see a house on fire over the road, I'm not just going to sit back and think, oh, I wonder what caused that fire. Let's try and figure it out and stop them happening in the future. You'd get straight onto 999 and call the fire service, and you'd hope that those firefighters would be well equipped, well trained, and come and deal with that fire there and then. And in the same way, we think that it's really important to have good programs that reduce violence in the here and now. Absolutely. So they need to be well evidenced, they need to be well resourced, and we need to have lots of them around to deal with violence. But to the extent that they crowd out this issue of what is causing the fire, the violence, then that's a problem. So if a city, if suddenly hundreds of houses across a city have got fires springing up in them, it's not like we keep just getting more and more fire engines and firefighters out there. At some point, we think, why is it that all these fires are coming alight on people's houses? We need to figure out how to prevent the fires from happening in the first place. And that is what I think the last sentence sums up, where Luke says, but the most substantial positive change would come from better addressing the source of the inferno, the incendiary socio-economic historical predicament, which far too many children and young people find themselves in. And to that point, I'm going to pass over to Des. Thank you very much, Des.
Thank you both very, very much indeed. As you know, I'm huge fans of your work, and we'll do anything to get a free copy of the book, up to and including agreeing to chair this launch. So that was well played by me. A really quick question, just one from me, because there's a couple of excellent ones coming through in the Q&A. This is a topic that attracts considerable political and policy interest, and my personal view is there's almost nothing more dangerous than something that politicians are worried about but not very well informed about. So I'm wondering if you've got any tips or reflections on how you write about such a live topic and maintain policy and public attention without fueling this really unhelpful, sensationalist, Helena Handcart, pearl clutching kind of discourse that can sometimes emerge. My words, not yours.
Do you want me to go, Luke, or would you like to go?
You can go first and I'll say
Okay, first. Okay. It's a difficult one, I would say, and I've been burned many times, Des, in work in this space. When I was first doing it many years ago, I contribute to some awful media pieces where journalists phone me up and you kind of feel flattered that they want your voice, and you talk to them and suddenly this horrendous piece appears in the media and it's completely out of context and the language is awful. So I think it's a great question, and it's really, really important that we're careful with what we do. I think probably three things shortly. I think you need to be close to the data. I think that's really important. It's a dry and boring answer, but if you want to avoid sensationalizing the issue, you've got to know what the data is and what we do know and what we don't know, and be really close to, or as close as possible with the best evidence out there. And that is why we've got chapter 1 in the book. That's why we go to extensive care to outline how much we know about violence and how much we don't. I think the second thing is then, once you know that, you've got to be really careful with the language you use to describe that data. And so one of the things that we kind of reel against is the actual term youth violence. Like, language like that is not helpful. One of the reasons is that kind of ties together youth and violence in a way that is not good. When people think of youth now, because of that phrase youth violence, we often tie together youth and violence, and it makes it sound as if the violence belongs to young people. It's the responsibility of young people, when in fact we know that society plays a big role. Many of the adults and institutions in society play a big role in precipitating that violence between young people. And then the final thing I'd say is that, aside from those two things, a bit more abstractly, we just need to keep our end goal in mind, in that we need to be clear on what we're trying to achieve. And I think often we can lose sight of those big end goals that are actually really important. So bringing violence down, creating societies with high levels of flourishing, low levels of social harm, that's what we're moving towards. And I think too often people in this space focus kind of myopically or narrowly on little things they're doing, like, will this blog or this book sell copies? Will people read it? So journalists writing stories, am I creating a headline that's going to attract attention? Politicians, am I creating a statement that's going to gain me political capital? We've got to be really careful with that. And so that is what I would say, those three things.
Really helpful. Luke? So a clear warning to not be in it for the clicks.
Yeah.
And I think you did a really good job of that in Youth Violence Commission. I thought you managed to make a unapologetically very political issue transcend party political interests. Luke, if I can, I'd like to ask you a different question. I think you're really well positioned to take this one. It's from a colleague in the Q&A. Hi, Kirsty. Who's curious, what would you say is the single most important thing that a practitioner can do to support the change that you're advocating for? Because we don't expect individual practitioners to, bring down the neoliberal state yet.
Yeah, they could try. No, I think it's a few things. I think all of us who are working directly with young people are trying in different ways to do multiple things at once. I think one thing is effectively communicate care to the young people that we're working with in such a way that is impactful for them, and that looks entirely different depending on the young person, and work effectively on a one-to-one or a group basis with the young people that are kind of we're there to serve. The other thing is platforming young people in order to help them push for change, and it's something that I've done through my kind of day job at Hackney Quest, and many other brilliant organizations have done that, like Reclaim Manchester, Take Back the Power, Account Hackney, and then also, as appropriate, it's about us as adults advocating for change on the basis of our understanding and our expertise. And I think it's really hard, and I've made plenty of errors in terms of making the judgment call about when to shut up and platform young people versus when to advocate for young people. I've taken young people along to plenty of council meetings that left them feeling utterly bored and disillusioned, and on the flip side, I've been to events where I've spoken and I feel like this shouldn't be me. So I think it's always a mixture of balancing support for those individual young people as they need it, and based around the needs that they have, and then supporting young people's voices, but then also I think not being shy as adults who know the lives of young people, who've got expertise from working with large numbers of young people, to push for the changes that we know are needed and that young people are telling us are needed.
It's really helpful, because in our efforts to platform young people's voices and to get out of the way, we are still the ones being paid as adults to do our jobs as well. And there's a nuance in that. I think being youth-led doesn't absolve us in any way. I want to turn now to a question which I think a lot of us be curious about. We're often told, aren't we, that Scotland, specifically the city of Glasgow, is held up as an example for England and Wales to follow. So Keir, I know that you've written on this because I was involved in it a little bit. Any thoughts on what we could learn from Scotland? And you might want to offer some caution around what can and can't be transplanted across different contexts. I don't know, maybe.
That's a really difficult question, because we're currently involved in a project that's looking at that in detail, and we're going to be reporting on it next year. I actually think, Luke, I don't want to pass the buck here, but I think you might be in a better position to answer this one. I'm more than happy to add to something, but if you want to go.
All right, you put me on the spot now. So if what I say is rubbish, it's basically your fault.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's maybe a bit of an abstract answer, but what I'm most impressed by is the extent to which the efforts towards violence reduction were about addressing structural inequalities, about institutional change in society. It was about, getting enforcement right. It was about a lot of different things. But if you've got the kind of programmatic, tactical interventions to address proximal causes here, and then you've got trying to think about how society might need to change over here, it feels like there was this sustained effort to do everything across that spectrum. Whereas the concern is that in England, we're too far towards this end. We're too far towards silver bullets, quick fixes, and bracketing out society, which I don't think, I mean, as is very clear, I don't think is the right approach necessarily.
Sorry, just to add to that, I think that's absolutely right. I think that the issue is that it's not easy to then translate those lessons from Scotland into our context, isn't it, Luke? So what the violence reduction unit did, for example, in Scotland, what they were able to do is not necessarily achievable for violence reduction units in England and Wales because of the kind of political and institutional structure that we have. So it's difficult to learn lessons, but we'll be writing about this and, producing policy reports and papers in 2023. So watch this space, I guess, because we will answer this in full, but it's difficult to answer in a very short period of time.
Fair enough, you're off the hook. It links, though, to I think a very good question that Tom's asking the Q&A about. Most of us in this audience, certainly, you're preaching to the choir, I suggest, aren't you, in terms of needing to tackle systemic issues. But we're about to go into a winter where families are quite literally choosing between heating and eating, where young people are having to choose, but make survival choices. Any advice on how we can get some meaningful political discourse? And do we have to start with, oh, but look, the Scots are doing it? Do we have to be that cynical? I'm ready to be that cynical if it works. How do we get meaningful political discourse, recognizing that the inequalities paradigm won't immediately be palatable to everyone that needs to step up?
You want me to go, Luke? I think this is difficult because it's one where you don't want to leave an answer that's utterly lacking in hope, right? But we're in a difficult space. Like, it feels like our politics is broken. Like, I always think that there's huge potential for political activism at a grassroots level. And I think we see that at the moment with lots of grassroots activism and different policy issues. And I think there's real potential for those in the years to come, partly due to actually technology helps to connect us. And I think there's real positive potential in that. But I do think actually big sweeping changes are needed at a political level. Because I think fundamentally we need politics to solve this. A lot of people want to bypass the political process. I don't think we can. But I think we need a change in the way that we do politics. I think kind of calling our system a democracy is a democracy in a very weak sense, right? We turn up to a voting booth every 4 years and tick a box, and that's pretty much it. Like, I actually think there are big political changes that are needed. I want to talk a lot about what those are, and I want to write and think about those, but that's a kind of a next project to be done. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Luke, at this point.
I think just very briefly, there are movements and there are campaigns and there are things happening that give me great hope. I think the campaign Enough is Enough is doing a very good job. And I also get immense hope and encouragement from the activism and the sentiment among young people, because a lot of the young people I work with display what is a bit of a clunky phrase, but I call it a fruitful intolerance. It feels like there's certain things that my generation kind of grew up with and just kind of shrugged and accepted, that now young people are saying, this isn't tolerable. This isn't how we should be running a society. What are the older generations leaving us with? We need to change this. And that applies to things like the climate emergency, but it applies across the board to the inequalities that I mentioned as well. And that gives me a lot of hope. And I would hope that there's a means for the policymakers to be responsive to that.
Can I build on that? I want to merge a question. Hi, thank you, Elaine, around my words, not yours, Elaine. How do we actually destroy neoliberal capitalism? Just a little question there. And another question that's come in from a colleague elsewhere. I'm looking at Fraser, who's talking about those bottom-up resources and movements. What advice or thoughts do you have around how adults, professionals, community leaders, parents, wherever we're positioned, how do we help young people to exercise that activism, that sense of a movement rather than passive recipients of an intervention? So I'm bringing two questions together there and inviting any thoughts you have. How do we light the right kind of fires for those young people? I'm about to launch into, I believe the children are our future, but you don't want to hear me.
I think, firstly, thank you for your comment, Elaine, because I read that, and it's nice to see lots of familiar names in the questions and people that have been really supportive and encouraging. So thank you for that. And I'm not just buying time. I think Elaine's spot on in how she wrote her question, that those inequalities in the 4 R's that I mentioned don't spring from nowhere. They're not there because we've got some organic society that has developed kind of naturally, and those things have happened to occur. We've got a certain form of political economy, call it late capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, whatever you want to call it. Is a hyper unequal form of running a society, and I think in order to change that, I think, like I say, I think I go back to the existing movements, things like Enough is Enough, things like the activism that young people are partaking in, and I think what I try to do as somebody who's working directly with young people in the community is balance kind of the one-to-one support that we can offer as professionals, the kind of community level change that like I engage in Hackney, and then try and do things like this book to contribute in some kind of way to the bigger, larger scale change. So that's probably a partial answer to some of the question.
It strikes me as well that there's a parallel. There's the helping young people who are affected by and who care about violence to exercise their political and I would say, you know, their activist identities. There's also something about those who are engaged in things like deliberative democracy and citizen assemblies and look at political reform to get them to care about violence and young people. We need to be able to ride both horses, I think, to see that kind of change. Yeah,
definitely. And I think again, like on the there's a lot of brilliant organizations like Hackney Account, like Forefront Project, like that are galvanizing young people and communities affected by violence to push for change, and in ways that are kind of as bold as is needed, challenging the status quo, challenging how things are. And I think, like you say, there's those I believe that they are, but they could be more connected to those wider movements about the nature of democracy and kind of the nature of our politics.
Can I ask a little bit about the sort of problematizing discourse that Gabe mentions this institutional reinforcement of narratives and terminology that problematize and stigmatize young people? You know, calling it youth violence is a great example. We don't call it women and girls violence, do we? And so the question is around how young people can resist in positive, progressive ways those sorts of narratives. So I guess my question is, how do you think we can help and support young people to resist those narratives? Who needs to change the story? Who's that on?
I think it's on all of us. I think it's on how we engage with politicians and the media. Like, I mean, I didn't want to leave you with a despairing sense that our democracy is completely broken. We have no influence. Like, because I mean, things like the Cross-Party Youth Violence Commission, it was quite amazing how doors to power opened relatively easily once we pushed hard enough and got enough people saying the same thing. And I guess that was seen in Scotland. So you go back to what happened in Scotland, right? They enough people saying the same thing and being on the same page and pushing in one direction is powerful. And we got through into corridors of power and, you know, meetings with ministers. And I think you can make a difference by doing that. And again, I think connecting on things like social media in order to, you know, bring groups together. I do think numbers are essentially power, and people are essentially responsive to that. So I would say it's basically connecting people together. A bit like the way, I mean, I mentioned the Hope Collective. There are probably some people here who've got something to do with the Hope Collective at the moment. You go and look up that movement as well. You know, it's bringing different people together and using technology as a means to do that. I think that there is potential there. What do you think, Luke?
No, I agree with all of that, and I guess the other kind of fairly obvious thing to say is all of us everywhere challenging the kind of simplistic, stigmatizing nonsense that we see about young people, wherever it is. Because the moment you start empathetically, engaging with a young person for more than a week or two,
yeah,
all of those cliches, all that simplicity melts away. And so I think it's on all of us to engage properly with young people in whatever way we can, and then to challenge the nonsense that we see. But it's a tough task because young people they're always an easy scapegoat. They always have been since like the time of Plato. And so there's a lot of power behind stigmatizing young people because it's incredibly convenient for a lot of people to do it.
And that stigmatization, it plays out in I think a really excellent contribution to the chat there from Lauren. Hi, Lauren. Reflecting on that fire analogy and recognizing that, of course, some fires get more attention and whose house is on fire matters more than others. So I guess I noticed this self-reinforcing loop that the people who are often most marginalized, minoritized, silenced and surveilled are the ones most affected by the fires, and they are arguably at a political level, societal level, they're the fires we least care about. And so we reinforce the inequality by not noticing. We reinforce the not matteringness. I'm not an academic, which I think does lead us into big system change. Macro level challenges, as some have put in the chat. I'm going to need to draw us to a close. I think it's really important that we do finish on a hopeful note. So before I say a couple of words at the end, what one thing, magic wand time, what one thing do you think we could do as a country that would make the biggest difference?
I'll let you go. You've probably got better answers to this one than I do.
I've got like a cheat answer because it's like a few things wrapped up in one. But I think change the education system is the headline. And I think essentially all schools, all educational institutions should be doing 4 things. They should be excelling at academic education, intellectual enrichment, nourishment, all of that, but also at providing care and support to young people, safeguarding young people, and also identifying and supporting additional needs. A lot of schools do all those things very brilliantly, but our education system is not conducive to resourcing or encouraging all schools to do all of those 4 things. And I think if that was the case, then we'd have a lot more safety and a lot more flourishing among our young people.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think for me, it's probably a cheat as well, but I think there's something about politics here again. I think we have to fundamentally change the way that our political system's working. And one of the ways to do that is for people to be far more focused on policy outcomes rather than just voting for a political party. Like too often we get parties that produce manifestos, promise lots of policies, and then nothing happens to actually produce those manifestos and no accountability. Like I think when we go to a voting booth, we need to be able to assert the sort of policy areas that we care about and the policy outcomes that we care about. And I think that if we can tweak that and if we can turn political accountability on its head so that politicians are more accountable for what they're doing when they're in power, like I feel all this stuff that we want to achieve then becomes possible, because it's very easy to articulate where we need to go without having the mechanisms to get there. And I think changes to our political process are really important, and it's what I'll probably be working on next. I think maybe I'll write a blog on it, Des.
That'll change the world, eh?
Exactly. Get some clicks on that. Yeah.
A little bit of homework for you, folks, if you don't mind, because there's some really, really rich stuff in the Q&A. Would you mind ever so much in between parenting your young children and doing your day jobs? Might you be able to put out something which would be accessible for integrated care systems? There's got to be an opportunity with these integrated care systems to speak across the kind of the boundaries of local services that might speak to some of the structural issues you're talking about. It'd be enormously helpful if you could make some sort of offering for violence reduction units who, of course, distribute significant funding. It'd be great to make sure that they're engaged. I know that many of them have been, but across the piece in this kind of bigger system thinking. There's something really frightening for local authority colleagues at the moment around how they revert back to statutory duties. They too are choosing between heating and eating, and whether there's something you could offer around that community partnership approach. What's the whole place local offer rather than statutory services continuing to do more with less? And I was very struck by your gentle but respectful, I think, critique around if we only focus on discrete interventions, we're not getting anywhere. I think that has really important implications for how we do evidence gathering, evaluation. I guess you're inviting us to think not only about what works, but what matters. So if you could just, sort that out, please, and come up with a framework for how we evaluate outcomes in a way that are not simply discrete interventions borrowed from America because they have a different attitude to taxation there. That would be terrific. I will be following up.
We can put our kids on the case. The 3 of them.
There we go. Yeah.
Probably.
But more seriously, I want to thank you for your work. I think it's an incredibly important contribution. I look forward to next time we speak, and you can tell me a little bit more about how mattering affects young women and their significance or insignificance. I think that's a really, really important angle on it. And thank you for taking such a serious, such a frightening issue and talking unashamedly and unapologetically about peace and love. It's not something that we hear enough of, I think, in this work. And at this time of year, or very nearly, it's exactly what we should be talking about. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you for letting me be part of this conversation. Really fantastic comments in the Q&A. So do take a look at them, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Des. And to Luke and Keir, it was a brilliant discussion of all the nuances that lie behind the headlines. And personally, I thought it was great to hear how young people are speaking up, moving the dial on politics and media representation. And that's something that we've got a long way to go with in the UK. I'm sure everyone would agree. Keir and Luke give loads more policy details on how we can give young people back a sense of agency and mattering in their book. So if you're able to, do go ahead and use that 50% discount on the right-hand side to buy the book. I'm sure you won't regret it. We'll also send a link of the recording of this webinar next week, which you can drop back into anytime. And do share it with your friends and colleagues who couldn't make it today. I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone, all of the panelists and everyone who attended today, and hope to see you at a future webinar soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye for now.